Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our third week of our course, a virtual executive trade course. Let me first thank all of those who sent us the evaluation for week 2. Thank you very much for this. And to remind those who may have not done it yet, to please fill it out and send it to us as soon as possible. Now, let us begin our week 3 with the module 3, which will focus on services trade in times of COVID and overview of main developments and resulting policy challenges. Let me introduce our team, our colleagues from the Trade in Services and Investment Division, who will be with you this week. And also just briefly mention that we'll be meeting with you in this module 3 times, on 3 days, in fact. This afternoon session, then there will be a recap and interactive Q&A session on Thursday, 3rd March, the morning and afternoon sessions being identical. And then just a reminder that on Friday, there will be one session. This will be a roundtable discussion, which will start at 1:30 or 13:30 Geneva time. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Antonia Carzaniga, Rosie Zhang, and Martin Roy, our colleagues from Trade and Services and Investment Division, and I give the floor to Martin Roy. Thank you. Have a good session.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Alicia. Let me jump right into it. Thank you for your taking part in this. I know it's quite early or quite late for a good many of you. What we want to do in this introductory session on services is to first provide an overview of the general trends in terms of the impact that the pandemic has had on trade and services, and also an overview of the types of measures or trade measures taken by governments in response or in that context. So I will start and provide this kind of general overview, and then my colleagues will follow up with a more focused presentation looking at the impact and role of services in supply chains in the context of the pandemic, and again, the role and impact and implications of services in terms of digitization. Overall, I think the thing that we see is that services has been the most impacted sector. So it has been impacted a lot more than trade and goods. So it is the most impacted trade component. Sorry, let me just set this up. And so I think it also means that services, looking a bit beyond the pandemic, I think it means that trade and services will be key for the economic recovery that we want to see at the end of this pandemic. And it also raises the question in terms of the type of policy response that governments can have to facilitate this recovery, and the kind of trade response that they can have to try to facilitate this recovery. A lot of the measures that have affected trade and services during the pandemic were not necessarily measures that are governed or targeted in the WTO, but there's a whole lot of other measures that can be, and actions that could be taken to facilitate the recovery of trade and services as we move beyond this pandemic, hopefully soon enough. Services was the most impacted by the pandemic, but that was not necessarily a given, from the start, because historically, or at least if we look at some of the big shocks that we've had, for example, the last big economic crisis in 2008, services proved much more resilient than goods trade. But this time around, it was not like that. Services was most affected because it was both a severe supply and demand shock. What we see in a key characteristic that will flow through this presentation and the other ones is that we see a strong negative impact overall, but also a lot of variation And that is a key characteristic, in that the impact was very different across different, not only members, of course, but across different services sectors, and across also different modes of supply, different forms of trade and services. And so the impact of the pandemic was a bit to change the structure of trade and services during that time, in that some sectors, or trade in some sectors, increased very significantly in relative terms, and same thing for certain modes of supply. And the reason for this variation or difference across sectors and modes is largely because of the type of response taken by governments, the type of policies that they put in place to combat the pandemic. Because of course, a lot of measures taken by governments were to protect the population by limiting mobility, or imposing measures limiting or imposing some social distancing. And so the services sectors that rely more on physical proximity between the supplier and the producer were most affected. And clearly also in terms of trade, the modes of supply that rely more on the physical proximity were also most negatively affected. So a key impact of the pandemic was that what we call modes 2 and mode 4, so trade and services through the movement of consumers abroad to go and consume services in foreign markets, or mode 4, which implied a movement of natural persons across border. Of course, that was largely paralyzed because of restrictions on mobility of people, whether consumers or suppliers. And so that was very largely paralyzed in the earlier phase of the pandemic, and to this day, the effects are still clearly seen. Another key general characteristic of the impact, Rosie will discuss more transport services, but we saw initially a decline in merchandise trade because of the shock, and that had an impact on transport services that are used to transport the merchandise. But also what we saw, especially later on, is that disruptions and issues with respect to transport services had an impact on goods trade. So the impact went both ways. We saw also that there was a lot of different services sectors, again, where social distancing had a stronger impact, even domestically. And this impacted trade and services by impacting mode 3. So mode 3 is when you invest abroad, you establish abroad to provide a service. And of course, a lot of services sectors were, had reduced activity because of the types of measures taken, whether retail, recreational services, and that also affected trade and services through mode 3. So that's in terms of the negative impact, but we also saw that there was a number of sectors where trade and services actually increased, and where trade and services played a very significant role in terms of ensuring resilience and allowing our economies around the world to continue to function. And there was a much greater focus during the pandemic on online supply of services. So companies in different sectors shifted their focus, shifted their activities to the extent they could to online or digital services, whether it's in retail or health or education or all kinds of other services. And that really proved important to ensure that we continue to function, not only through online education services, to be able to telework also, and a number of different types of services, such as telecommunication services, have allowed for this these different forms of online supply to actually take place. And we have seen a very significant increased demand on ICT and telecommunication services throughout the crisis. Generally, the sector had coped quite well, and we have seen also increased international data traffic throughout this crisis in response and reflecting this general increased demand. Now, if we look at the impact, again, it varies from sector to sector. It's impossible to really look in much detail at all the sectors, maybe just to focus or spend a bit more time on tourism, because it was clearly the most affected sector because, again, of the limits because of the nature of the crisis and the types of measures limiting mobility, limiting the movement of tourists, so consumers going abroad to consume tourism services. And this has resulted in a very significant drop in international tourist arrival, especially in the first year of the pandemic in 2020, 65% drop. At the worst of it in June, July, it was, or by mid-year in 2020, it was down 93% compared to the previous year. So this is where really the impact has been most severe. And tourism is an important sector for a lot of countries, especially developing countries, a number of smaller island countries. This is not only a very significant part of their services exports. Tourism represents about almost 25% of world cross-border trade and services. But for many countries, it accounts for a much larger share, a large share also of their total exports, and in many cases, a significant part of their GDP. So the crisis hit the sector very hard and had important implications economically and socially also. But you see some numbers. We still have a very long way to go to come back to the pre-pandemic levels. There was a small improvement in terms of tourist arrivals or tourist receipt, a rise of 4% in 2020 compared to 2021 compared to 2020, but we're still very largely below the pre-pandemic levels. Now, I don't want to go in detail, look at different sectors, but it is interesting. So if you do have an interest in the services sectors, we have looked at that through the DG monitoring report that is mentioned here. The symbol is WTOV23, looking at the impact of the pandemic in different sectors where it led to increased trade or different types of policy responses, and other sectors where the impact was largely negative. So I invite you this is something we are happy to discuss further. I invite you to consult if you have further interest. Now, it's important to have this general picture of the impact of the pandemic on trade and services, looking at differences across sectors, across modes. Now, we also get an important picture looking at the latest trade statistics. However, as you may well know, statistics in trade and services are not, do not capture trade to the same extent as they might for goods. So what we have are balance of payment statistics that only capture essentially, international transactions through mode 1, cross-border trade or cross-border supply, mode 2, and part of mode 4. Still, it does show a few very important things. So the latest data we have is, complete data we have is for the third quarter of 2021. And what you see in this chart is not the absolute level of trade or exports. It is a comparison of change. So compared to the previous year's quarter. So what you see from this chart is first that looking at 2020, the worst of the crisis, that services was hit harder than goods trade. So in the worst quarters, it was down about almost 30% year on year. So the impact there was worse than for goods. And also it took more time, and it's still taking more time for trade and services to recover. So we have seen at the end of last year an important recovery in services trade, again compared to the previous year, to 2020. And this was largely due not to tourism, but mostly to increased exports and trade in different types of digital services, so computer services, and other types of services that can be supplied online. And also because of an important rise in exports of transport services, although that was largely due to an increase in the cost of these services and shipping rates that Rosie will discuss with you later on. But overall, despite this recovery in 2021 compared to 2020, we're still below the overall levels of trade and services from before the pandemic. So we're still, Q3 2021 is still about 5% lower than Q3 2019. So here you see the shock, for tourism, for transport, which were the two maybe most affected sectors. This picture is interesting because here we don't look at the change year on year, but we rather look at pre-pandemic versus the current situation or the most recent situation. And here what we see is that there are some sectors, like computer services in particular, where there has been an important overall increase in trade compared to 2019. So exports of computer services, or global exports of computer services, up 34% in the first 3 quarters of 2021 compared to 2019. Again, because of this shift dictated by the response to the pandemic, the policy measures taken, which has encouraged online supply, and this is reflected in increased trade and increased trade under Mode 1 for this sector, and an increase in exports in the sectors for both developing countries like Mauritius or Bangladesh, and also various developed countries. And here I'll leave you with this data. I don't want to go into detail. So you see that the number of countries, again, still have much lower services exports now or in 2021 than they did before the pandemic. Again, mostly because of the impact on tourism and various other services sectors. Now, in terms of the measures taken by governments, I think, of course, it varies a lot by sector. There was not a lot of very stringent trade restriction as may have been the case in goods trade. We have tried at the WTO to monitor the different types of measures affecting services trade that were taken. And I think there the general message is that mostly the measures that appear to be justified or linked to COVID-19, on the face of it, were mostly facilitative measures that aim to facilitate trade. So measures to provide greater capacity to telecom operators, to facilitate access to telecommunication services, to facilitate the online supply of telemedicine or education services, and which affected also trade. At the same time, of course, there are some measures that were taken and justified on the face of it by being a reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic that were more restrictive, and this tended to focus or be related to measures that tightened the foreign investment screening in a number of countries, typically a number of developed countries that have limited capacity to, or that have restricted capacity, or make it more difficult to have foreign impositions of certain services businesses. And to conclude, I think I'll just highlight a few general messages. So strong impact, strong negative impact overall, which has very strong economic and social implications because of the weight of services in economies. But at the same time, the crisis, I think, also showed the key role of the sector and of trade and services in ensuring resilience, because a number of services sectors enabled other sectors to continue functioning, and services trade and services trade policies had a role in affecting the performance of these sectors during the pandemic. And I think that was really something that was strongly underscored, and clearly services will have a key role to play in the recovery that will come and the future resilience. Just to leave you in light of these general takeaways with what you see on the screen now, which is, you may be aware of this, but there has been a lot of discussion last year in the WTO to have a ministerial declaration or to have a WTO response to the pandemic covering different trade-related issues. This is still ongoing. Of course, this discussion will continue up to the ministerial, but there is, interestingly, there is a section of that draft which was put together by the General Counsel facilitator that focuses on services, which is not always the case in ministerial. And this is interesting because it does highlight the key role of the sector, the impact of the pandemic, the role of the logistics that Rosie will now talk about, the role of ICT and online supply, and the key importance of services trade and of facilitating services trade to encourage the recovery. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll gladly come back with your questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I think we have Antonia speaking, or Rosie.
Hello. Yeah, I am going to take over with, I will focus on only one sector. One particular issue is about current shipping disruptions. Let me first share my screen. Okay. Yeah, as you know that maritime transport services always served as the lifeblood of global economy because I don't know why this is appear again. Let me first click. Okay. Yeah. 80%, more than 80% of world trade is carried by sea in volume, and more than 70% in value is also by transport by sea. And then as Martin has already pointed out, that the COVID pandemic has significant impact on maritime transport. Yeah, he pointed out the if you look at the value, it seems that there's a recovery, but then actually shipping disruptions are still ongoing across the globe. I think I'm sure that you are aware of that, because shipping disruptions, or call it supply chain bottlenecks, have been on the spotlight since second half of 2020. You are aware of massive port congestions, shortage of empty containers, inland transport log jams, and also several crises, and also shortage of truck drivers in some economies. Okay, and then so I'm going to take a closer look at this sort of supply chain bottlenecks, and then also to share with you what are the implications of all these bottlenecks. So first, what happened to shipping during COVID-19 pandemic? As you may recall that, first it happened, I think this first half of 2020, there was a dramatic drop in demand because governments, many countries, they implemented COVID restrictive measures. Martin already mentioned lockdowns, border closures, and other measures. The purpose, of course, these measures were to contain the spread of virus, and then production was largely slowed down with many factories temporarily closed. And then, so this is a dramatic drop in demand. And then you know that shipping is dependent on demand of consumer goods. So in response to the abrupt drop of demand, shipping lines had to reduce capacity by slow steaming and blank sailing. As a result, large numbers of containers piled up at the ports and inland depots waiting for pickup. And then, that's mainly in North America. But on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, for example, the main exporters in East Asia, they don't have empty containers to export their products. How serious is that situation? Actually, for example, look at United States, 40% of 100 containers arrive, they are exported, and 60 continue to accumulate. And then follow that, in the second half of 2020, we saw a surge in demand for consumer goods because United States and the other developed economies, they adopted stimulus package, and then as ports and warehouses were subject to COVID restrictions and the trucking capacity was reduced, container turnaround times were dramatically lengthened. And also there's a sharp rise in e-commerce sales, which reduced also the amount of available warehousing space to the point that many containers were used as extended storage or ad hoc warehouse, okay, which also contributed to the delays in container turnaround times, okay. So overall, COVID measures led to slow port operations, and then slow down also customs procedures, make seafarers change difficult, and then plus there are other problems like empty containers I already mentioned, shortage of warehousing space, and also there are also problems in labor supply. So all this happened to shipping during COVID pandemic. And then this led to a massive bottlenecks along the maritime supply chain, including port congestions, ship arrival delays, and log jams, inland transport, and also I mentioned that the empty container problem, and also 200,000 seafarers, they are stranded on the sea because they cannot, because of COVID restrictions, they had no access to medical care, and also to the exchange of duty. And also there is also shortage of warehouse space, and also shortage of port facilities. And then this is to show you that port congestions took place across the globe, almost in all the major ports. And then so this is associated with all the massive restrictions across the board. And then also we also note that global liner reliability was very poor in 2021 because port congestions led to, I mentioned that the delays in ship berthing and loading and unloading, and delays in port are having knock-on effects on the ship schedules and lead to missed sailing and also missed capacity. Just one simple indicator, a couple of days delay at one port can end up adding 2 weeks to a container ship total journey time. Okay, this is if you look at the chart on the left side, just to show you that the major shipping lines, their reliability in 2021 lower than 40%. And then you compare that to 2018, 2019, even 2020. This is really very poor. And then the chart on right side is about the average delays for ship arrivals. And then if you look at that, that in 2021, the average delay reached almost 8 days in late 2021. So this means that the delays of the ships, this has serious consequence because all these bottlenecks, they held up the shipping, effective shipping capacities. Freight, cannot be, unloaded at the ports. And then, so if you look at this chart to show you the freight on stationary ships, that means the ships waiting outside ports at the end of 2021, up to 14% of the shipping capacity, actually was removed from the market. Okay, so you see then there's this led to a mismatch between supply and demand, and then the demand for shipping largely outweighed the shipping capacity, the supply. So all the bottlenecks, I just mentioned that they reduce shipping capacity, and then of course because of this imbalance between supply and demand, that pushed up shipping rates to record highs. If you look at the rate in late 2021, from especially September, October, that's this is World Container Index that's put together the shipping rates along all the trade routes, and also including all the type of shipping, container, all type of container shipping. And then if you look at that, and then so the late 2021, that was record high, and then even today, the latest data as of 24th February, the average of composite index still very high for 40-foot container, still near 10,000 US dollars, 81% higher than the same week 2021, and double the average freight rate, 5-year average. Okay. And then if you look at the trade routes, the major trade routes from Shanghai to Europe and North America, you will see the increase of freight rates. Okay, so even today, they remain at very high level. Okay, and then this is some I find interesting is that if you look at the spot rates by major route, and then this will show you the imbalance of trade. So from East Asia to Europe and to the United States, the freight rates are much higher than the other way, from Europe to East Asia, from North America to East Asia. This reflects the imbalance of trade, of goods trade. Okay. Okay. Now I will just to highlight some impacts of shipping disruptions. The first one, of course, the rising shipping rates, of course, increased trade costs. Okay. You know, transport costs account for a big chunk of trade costs, or for almost all the goods. This is, for example, to show you that if you look at agriculture, hunting, forestry, and fishing, transport costs represent 26% of trade costs. For mining, that is 24%, and for manufacturing, 29%. And then if you look at the breakdown of manufacturing, you look at different products, and then so you will see that many products, the transport costs represent 1/3 of trade cost. And then if you look at the trade between the economies, low income, high income, or between high income and lower income economies, transport represents also a major, represents a main determinant of trade cost. Okay, so this is about increased trade cost. What I want to highlight is that a challenge for all traders, this is soaring trade cost, but especially for small and the medium enterprises, compared with larger players, small and medium enterprises, because they have a very fragile financial status, and so they are at a disadvantage when negotiating trade rates, and also they have difficulty absorbing additional expenses, and then so their margins are eroded, and some of them have already retreated from world market. Another important impact is the disruption of global supply chains. Okay. This is because now, when we talk about globalization, one important feature of globalization is that today production is organized, at the global level. The production processes are, organized or dispersed at the global level. Because of that, okay, goods manufactured through global supply chains are exposed to shipping disruptions, because in that process, many goods imported, exported, they are intermediate goods, and then so they may cross borders several times between or within regions. Okay. Another impact, of course, I think we are all experiencing is that consumer goods have been pushed up, and also the inflation is being exacerbated. Okay. And then implications for maritime transport services. This is also something that I think is important for the maritime sector. This is a highly liberalized market, global shipping market, and after sort of structural transformation, especially since 2008 financial crisis, shipping market is already highly concentrated. Now, after or because of the COVID pandemic, global shipping markets now is being further consolidated, and the shipping lines, they made huge profits, and then now they are investing their profits in purchasing assets, not just vessels, but also logistic facilities, including warehouses, trucking companies, distribution centers, and then shipping lines. They are now transforming themselves into end-to-end logistic providers. So this is very far-reaching, impact for transport and the logistics sector. And also, of course, the pandemic also shows that intermodal transport is more important than ever. And also very interesting, I think, that decarbonization and digitalization are being accelerated during the pandemic. New vessels ordered by shipping lines, they are more environmentally friendly with less carbon emission, and the ports and shipping lines, they have step up digitalization. They introduce digital technology and also increase automation in operation. So this is something that, and also port operation, including custom clearance, and also port operators, they are using digital technology to improve the efficiency in port operation, and also better use maritime data to predict ship arrivals and departures. Okay. But a downside, also very important, is shipping connectivity for small and remote economies is worsening due to their small market size. Small economies and remote economies is not just small market size, but also their disadvantages, geographic locations. They are not well connected compared to other economies. But during pandemic, shipping lines give priority to major trading routes. So the frequency, shipping frequency for small and remote economies is reduced, and then so the shipping connectivity for small and remote economies is worsening. But connected big economies, they have seen their shipping connectivity is further improved. Okay, here is to give you some questions for consideration and discussion. I don't think that I have answers to these questions, but I look forward to your views, your inputs on Thursday. Three probably broad questions. What are the factors within and outside maritime sector which led to recent shipping disruptions? And what lessons could be drawn from the impacts of these shipping disruptions, in particular for maritime transport services? And then the last question is there any role for trade policy and WTO to play to help developing countries mitigate negative impacts of shipping disruptions and resist future shocks? Okay, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosie. And now, Antonia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alicia. And hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. And I'm going to take over and do the last part of our joint presentation. Allow me just to first share my screen. And yes. So as you know, the presentation by Martin has highlighted clearly one thing that has emerged during the pandemic, a trend that was already on its way before COVID hit, is that a lot of trade has gone online, and this is what we, the WTO, call e-commerce, trade that is effectively taking place via electronic means. And the same is also true for when it comes to trading services. So I'm going to this afternoon very briefly try to focus, take a step back and look at why services matter for e-commerce and why e-commerce at the same time is particularly relevant for services and services trade. Then we'll touch upon what impact and what we've seen during the pandemic. I'll move on to the most recent discussions in the WTO that are of services relevance when it comes to e-commerce. And then finally, I'll leave you with some concluding observations and a few questions maybe to reflect on before we meet again on Thursday. But let me start off with services and why they matter for e-commerce. Essentially, services form the backbone of the infrastructure, if you want, of the supply chain of electronic commerce. If you think about what you do and what steps you take when you are involved in electronic commerce, all of us have to have access first to the internet, and that implies a reliance on a telecommunication service. Then we would, for instance, perform a search online for a particular product we're interested in, and that implies their underlying computer services. We'll click on a link that maybe points us to some products, and there we will see advertising services in the picture. Then we may decide we like what we see and we decide to order that product from a website, and that's a distribution service. And finally, we'll have to pay for that product. And again, here we're talking about financial services. And finally, we may decide to download whatever we've bought, which would make it either a service or, in the view of some WTO members, in some instances, it may be a good if it had that physical characteristic beforehand, or we would decide, for instance, to have it, if it is a good, a physical product, we would have it shipped. And there again, we would have communication services involved if we were to download it, and postal and courier and transport services if you were to have it physically shipped, physically transported to us. So what's the role of trade policy and of the GATS when it comes to those enabling services? Effectively, whatever trade policies governments put in place with regard to these particular services, they clearly have an impact on the development of the digital infrastructure. And as such, more widely, they also impact the digital economy. Now, when it comes to the WTO specifically, what WTO members can do is to undertake legally binding commitments, both when it comes to the market opening side of things, so with market access and national treatment commitments, but also complement those with sort of additional commitments that are further facilitative of that type of trade. For instance, like some members have done by undertaking commitments under the reference paper on telecommunications, which contains a number of pro-competitive principles for the sector. And they can do so under the GATS for the sectors that they consider most relevant, for instance, for in terms of enabling electronic commerce. And undertaking those commitments provide guarantees for that these services policies would be, for instance, conducive to greater digital connectivity. So commitments would provide transparency and increase the predictability of trading conditions, would enhance the credibility of policies because, of course, they provide guaranteed, committed levels of market openness. They would encourage competition, in particular foreign competition, and also if they were undertaken with respect to the establishment of a commercial presence, mode 3 of the GATS, they could also be used to encourage investment. However, the reality is that WTO members, so far at least, have made sort of uneven use of the possibility of undertaking commitments when it comes to that guarantee even the existing level of openness or even below existing levels of openness for the sectors that are particularly relevant in terms of e-commerce infrastructure. So if we look at the sectoral coverage of the commitments undertaken by WTO members, we see that although some of these basic infrastructural services, such as financial services, business services, and telecommunication services, have been committed by significant majority of WTO members, although even for such an important sector as telecommunication services, only about 2/3 of WTO members have guaranteed some degree of market openness. Other sectors that are particularly important for electronic commerce and for the online, for the digital economy more broadly, such as maritime transport, air transport services, or distribution services, have enjoyed, let's say, lower level of binding in GATS schedules. So let me now, this was, a focus or very quick overview of why services are important in terms of facilitating electronic commerce. But it's also true that electronic commerce is very important when it comes to services. And here I'll also say a few words about what what the impacts of COVID have been. So services not only enable electronic commerce, but they are also enabled by digital technologies. And in fact, technological advances have enhanced the cross-border tradability of services. So services are always tradable, but not all of them may be traded across borders. So they may be traded through the establishment of a commercial presence abroad, or the movement of natural persons, or the movement of the consumer into the territory of a foreign, into a foreign market. But with technology, the ability to trade services cross-border, like you would traditionally think about trade when it comes to trading goods, has certainly been enhanced. And this is particularly relevant for information-intensive services that can be digitized and then transmitted online across borders without any movement of the supplier or the consumer. But it is also additionally important to recall that digital technologies have reduced the cost for trade in services across the board, not exclusively for services that are traded via Mode 1, but they also facilitate and effectively reduce trade costs for trade in services through other modes of supply more generally. So here are some of the services sectors that you may think of as being, for instance, amenable to being supplied online. They include, some of the information-intensive sectors we've been talking about, particularly under business services, where you have a number of professional services, but also computer-related services, or the backbone with the communication services that, in addition to being enabling services of electronic commerce, they are also enabled by electronic commerce. And of course, audiovisual services also falls under that services sector. And then you have services like education or health and social services, but also financial services that have become particularly reliant on this online means of delivery during the pandemic for all the social distancing that it has entailed, but also some sectors that one may not associate necessarily with an online delivery, like tourism, that clearly has suffered, as Martin was saying earlier, during the pandemic, but of which elements can be supplied also remotely, such as, for instance, the reservation side of things. And of course, also recreational, cultural, and entertainment services. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it just to give you a sense of, the vast array of services that actually can be supplied cross-border through online means. And again, here the GATS has a role to play because by undertaking commitments in these particular sectors, it provides guaranteed access for these for suppliers of these particular sectors services to foreign markets. So there is a role for commitments both, if you want, on the enabling side and on the enabled side. Now, this has become extremely apparent and striking during the COVID pandemic because, and these are just a few pointers more than a comprehensive overview. For instance, during 2020, services trade fell by 21% and goods trade fell by 8%. So services trade, as Martin was saying earlier, significantly more affected by the measures that have been put in place to try and combat the spread of the COVID virus. But in this very bleak picture, it is striking that services such as computer services in particular were actually able to grow compared to the previous year, the non-COVID figures. And again, you see also positive growth for services financial services such as insurance and pension or banking services, but you also have, anecdotal information and that shows that, for instance, retail sales, the percentage of online retail sales out of the total increased significantly during the pandemic, from 16% in 2019 to 19% in 2020. So clearly the world went online, and then a lot of economic activity went online during the pandemic. And of course, this is all related to the social distancing and mobility restrictions that governments have introduced as a way to contain the spread of the virus. And in addition, so to these measures that to some extent restricted trade, even though they were justified on the grounds that, of the wider health of the population, governments have also taken measures that facilitated trade online supply of many of these services, such as, for instance, by making more capacity available to telecom operators, or facilitating the access of consumers to services such as online education or telehealth. However, what has also emerged during the crisis is the technology and connectivities disparities that exist amongst WTO members at different levels of development. And so while at the same time this has underscored how our online digital supply of many services has been able to keep many of our economies functioning, this has not been the same across the entire WTO membership. But at the same time, it has also further underlined how important the infrastructural services are for trade in this, and how important trade in the services sector is, not only for growth, but also for resilience during a crisis situations like the one we're still going through, and also in looking forward to in their importance in terms of recovery. So let me move to the last part of my presentation. I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our session, so I'll just say a couple of words and I'll be happy to elaborate further when we see each other on Thursday on this or anything else. But just to give you a sense of the discussions that are taking place in the WTO that are most relevant to the services aspects of electronic commerce. So first, there are the discussions in the multilateral work program, and when it comes to the Council for Trade in Services, the body that oversees the functioning of the GATS agreement, there's been quite a significant level of engagement by members who have shared information about the initiatives they have taken to enhance the digital capabilities of businesses and consumers. And these are both domestic initiatives, but also sort of activities and technical cooperation and capacity building that has been undertaken internationally. There's also been sharing of information about the most recent developments when it comes to electronic commerce. For instance, information about the development of the e-payment markets domestically, or the logistics sector, or the distribution sector, for example. But of course, members and developing countries in particular have called on the WTO discussions to focus very much on the development dimension of electronic commerce, and particularly on the challenges that developing countries face in this sphere. And there's been some discussion, although most of it has taken place in the General Council, about the moratorium in terms of what does it cover, the moratorium on the application of customs duties on electronic transmissions. Does it cover just the transmission or the content that is being transmitted? Is it applicable to services? What are the implications? as well as different views when it comes to the plurilateral joint statement initiative. But just one additional word to say that many of the other discussions that are taking place in the Council for Trade and Services, not specifically under the work program necessarily, touch upon issues of relevance to electronic delivery and electronic commerce. And then a couple of words only on the joint statement initiative, which started negotiations on electronic commerce rules in 2019 and sees the participation of 86 members. There you see an example of many of the issues that are discussed and negotiated under the JSI that also have a services trade relevance. So because we're at 4 o'clock, just a couple of concluding sum up observations. First, as we've said, services are really the backbone of the e-commerce infrastructure, and trade policy and the GATS have a role to play in this regard because they allow members to make credible commitments in sectors that are both enabling, supportive of the digital trade, if you want, as well as services that are enabled and that are amenable to being supplied cross-border. Clearly, the pandemic has further highlighted a trend that we were already witnessing, where the prominence of services that have been digitized and traded online has increased. And finally, we have ongoing discussions in WTO bodies, both multilaterally and in the context of the JSI, of issues that are of relevance to e-commerce when it comes to services. So let me share with you some questions. I will not read them out, but we can certainly make these slides available for you just to reflect and further ponder possible sort of topics for discussion. We will all see you again on Thursday, and so we'd be happy to take up these questions or any others you may have. We don't necessarily aim to provide answers. We don't necessarily have the answers, but we'd be welcoming an opportunity to share, to hear your thoughts and to engage with you on these issues. So with this, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonia and Rosie and Martin. We've reached our preview time for this session, and we will have indeed an interactive live Q&A session on Thursday. So I already invite you to join us either in the morning or in the afternoon, whichever suits you best. But in case there is any burning question right now, or in terms of clarification or an explanation of what was presented on the slide or what was said, we could perhaps spend 2 or 3 minutes maximum on clarifying something that perhaps needs to be done today. So I invite you to let us know, either raising your hand or writing it in the chat. We don't have much time because we are already past the time, and we have the session scheduled for Thursday to explore further, and especially to explore the questions by Antonia and Rosie. So, but if there is any need for clarification or explanation of something that was said and shown on the slides, I don't see anybody asking for the floor. I think that says it all, that it was clear and that we have the time reserved for Thursday, and then perhaps if needed a discussion on Friday afternoon during the roundtable. So that sounds very good. Just to let you know that the trainers have agreed to provide us with a copy of our presentations, so we will post them for you in the Google Drive. You also have the slides, of course, on the video recording, which we will be now converting into a video and sending you a link as soon as we can. Hopefully by tomorrow morning, we will be able to send you the link to this recording, the video recording, and we will, as soon as possible, post the presentations in the Google Drive. So with that, I thank you very much for being with us today, and invite you to connect with us on Thursday again. Thanks very much. All the best. I see one question now, maybe I'll just read it or trainers will see it, but I will read it out. Is the JSI that was referenced on digital trade or services regulation?
So the one that I was talking about was the one on e-commerce or digital trade, not the one on services domestic regulation. Of course, there is another one on services domestic regulation as well.
Thank you, Antonia, for this clarification. I don't see any other questions. Is there anyone from our colleagues, Martin, Rosie, Antonia, that wishes to add anything? Last thought before we close?
We look forward to seeing everyone again on Thursday.
Okay, I see another question. Will the draft or ministerial declaration remain the same for June?
Maybe I can answer that. If the idea is to refer to the draft ministerial declaration on the response to the pandemic, most likely will not be the same for June because, of course, this is not agreed. There's just been discussions going on last year, and members have started to discuss this again earlier this year, and I'm sure it will continue till MC12. And so what I showed you was a draft that resulted from discussions by members on services, but whether there will be anything or whether it will be expanded or reduced by MC12 and what is actually adopted, that remains to be seen.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. I see a question regarding the PowerPoint presentations, whether they will be shared with the participants. They were shown on the screen, and there will be a video recording of this session, so you will be able to view those presentations. But I leave it up to trainers to let us know. There is an afternoon session, so if they don't wish to share it before the afternoon to steal the thunder of their presentations, and if they share it with us, we will post it at the end of the day after the afternoon session. So then sort of no one is disadvantaged or advantaged too much to have the materials in advance. But the trainers will let us know if they would share it with us. And then we would, if that's the case, then we would post it in the Google Drive for you at the end of the day or before tomorrow. Okay, very good. I think we've passed the time and I don't see any other questions. Reflect, please, on what was said today and on those lead-in questions that were presented by our trainers. And we will see you again on Thursday. You, of course, have a choice to connect with us again at 3 o'clock if you wish, but it will be essentially the same material that we will be going over. Otherwise, I will see you again on Thursday, either at 9:30 or at 15 hours for our follow-up, recap, and Q&A session. Thank you very much for being with us and have a good day. Good night.